Now the second big topic we have is functions. Let's group everything we know about functions together. What is a function? Well, a function is when we have an input and get an output. And we usually note it as f of x equals to y. So we give an x value, we get a y value. Now, what is a domain and what is a range? Well, domain is the values that we can take in, the values that we can use in our function, and the range is the possible values that we get out, literally how our results ranges, from what number to what number. What is the criteria of a function? A function to be valid, it has to be one-to-one. So we must have a one-to-one function. And what does that mean? A one-to-one function means that for every x value, we must have only one y value. We must have a unique y value. And why is that important? Because otherwise we wouldn't be able to evaluate the function. For instance, what would happen if we said that the function when we take the value of 3 equals to 9, and the function when we take the value of 3 also gives us the result of -4. Well, that's very unclear because we don't know what is the actual result. Is it 9 or is it -4? So this is not one-to-one, this is an invalid function. So make sure that the function is one-to-one. Now, if a function is one-to-one, then it has an inverse. And what is an inverse function? We have an inverse function. Well, an inverse function by definition is just the opposite. X in terms of y. So x is a function of y now. We write x as a function of y, and that's how we note it, with that -1 over there, just to show that this is an inverse. Okay, what properties do we know for the inverse? Well, this is the most important property, that the domain of the inverse is equal to the range of the original function. And it makes sense, because what we get out of one function is what we put in the inverse of it. Literally, domain of one is the opposite, the range of the other, because the inverse is the opposite of the other. I hope this makes sense. And at the same time, the range of the inverse is equal to the domain of the original function. Now, whenever we have questions that they ask, find out the inverse and find out the domain, what is the process? What is the method of doing it? First, find the inverse. Second step, find the domain of the original. Find domain of f of x, because the domain of f of x will give us the range of the inverse that we need. Or the other way, we could find out the range of the inverse. Let me write it here. We could also find the range of the original function, and in that case we will find the domain of our inverse. One thing to keep in mind about functions, always make sure you use the right domain when you start solving. So when we have here f of x equals to y, make sure that we are setting the proper domain. For instance, if we have a division, remember that division by 0 is undefined. So if our function, let's say, is going to be x cubed plus 1 divided by x minus 4, well, we know that this thing cannot be 0. So in our domain, we must say that x cannot take the value of 4. One thing to keep in mind, and always when we deal with functions and overall fractions, divisions, remember, denominator cannot be 0. So always keep this in mind and make it a habit not to have a mistake. In the next video we'll have something more about functions, about shifting graphs.